Good afternoon, everyone. As you may know, I'm Charles Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Cultural Pluralism in the Arts Movement Ontario. And today we are really excited, I wouldn't say more than excited, ecstatic, and honored to have this panel of real activists, artists, critical thinkers across disciplines coming from Indigenous communities. It is a blessing to be able to work in this way, to bring these speakers forward, and to provide the space to them. So before we actually get into what the agenda is, I wish to offer a land acknowledgement to start us off. As we know, we are in Turtle Island, Toronto, Toronto. And really, we want to talk about the way in which Indigenous people have taken care of this land for millennia, particularly the agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe on the dish with one spoon, which is an incredible lesson that we attempt to take to heart in CPAMO. And that is, those who need to take from the land can take what they need, but one must leave things behind for those who come next. One must take care of the space and keep it clean, and so on. And with that, we attempt in CPAMO to learn from that and to act in that way, to share the resources we have, to encourage others to do the same in the arts, particularly if we're talking about working with Indigenous people, Black and people of color, others who are marginalized, who have been excluded from the spaces of the arts in Canada for quite some time, and who are now, well, not just now, but have for centuries, but particularly now, pushing to change that dynamic. And we think that during this time of COVID is an important time where we can start arguing more forcefully around social, political, cultural, economic transformation. But there is no returning to what people think was normal, because to many of us, it was not normal. So in recognizing the first peoples of this land, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, the Credit, the Métis who have come through this area, and others whose names we do not know, we want to start the session in that way. And to not just ask that we do land acknowledgements, but that we attempt to understand the values behind them and live in that way as best we possibly can. It's a real learning experiment that is important for us in developing relationships. Our agenda this afternoon is much the same as it has been for the previous sessions. We have a number of speakers. They will each speak for about 15 minutes. After each person speaks, you, those who are joining us this afternoon, have a chance to ask them a question or make a comment to which you want them to respond. If you do wish to do that, please, go to the chat room and connect with Kevin. Kevin will be sort of working on the chat box with us. And we just want to make sure that he gets your question directly or your comment, that it doesn't get lost in the other chats, and so on. And then he'll ask those questions. Those questions we've not been able to answer, we will attempt to get back to you by the speaker who was asked the question. That may take some time as we catch up on things, but one thing COVID has taught us is we do have some time we didn't have before. And we think this is important for a conversation. This session will be recorded. So if you know of people who couldn't make it today, who want to learn from it, we should be able to have it up in about a couple of weeks after we edit. And then we'll put it on our website. So without any further delay, I want to introduce our first three speakers. We have Clayton Windatt, who is a multidisciplinary artist, and has worked with CPAMO on a number of issues and has become close to the way we work, and we've learned a lot from Clayton. Clayton will be followed by Wanda Nanibush. Wanda also connected with CPAMO some time ago, moved on to a whole bunch of other areas, and now doing a lot of incredible work at the Art Gallery of Ontario. And we have Emma Steen, who's now with the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective, doing some incredible work around what's in art galleries and who's represented, more or less, who's not. That'll be our first hour. In our second hour, We have Ashley Bomberry, who we just learned is now the incoming director of the Canadian Association of Dance Artists, has worked with the Canadian Dance Assembly, did some work with CPAMO a while ago as well, and we're really pleased to have Ashley join us. Aria Evans, a multidisciplinary artist, dancer, theater, etc., and you know, a very close ally and friend. I'm running out of names here. Keith of Native Earth Performing Arts, a space that we prefer to use when we can, and so do many other people. It's a rather busy spot, Native Earth, and should be. And Keith also is a playwright and the artistic director there. And our final speaker today is Jesse Wente, very well known in the media and film community. Sorry, Jesse. Has also now recently been appointed as the chair of Canada Council for the Arts. We may have some time at the end of the session for an open conversation. We'll see how it goes. But with that, I want to invite Clayton to start us off.
Thanks, Charles. I'm really honored to be here today and be presenting alongside of everybody else. And I want to thank CPAMO for putting in work in this area, giving voice and platform to me and my Indigenous peers, but also for not doing it only over the last year, but for doing that kind of work consistently over a long period of time. So we're talking about all kinds of things, but I think we're mostly looking at the shifts that have been happening in major institutions and whether or not how that's going. I mean, I'm not going to assume anything, but I'll just start from my own place and say a large part of my job working within the arts sector has been navigating between peoples and trying to understand where the mutual benefit can lie in working together. And that's often complicated and challenging because sometimes a formalized group doesn't want to have sort of a collaborative relationship. They'll want to have you kind of conform to their way of being. And sometimes the people you're working with or that you're representing are not interested in that sort of assimilation-like behavior. So it becomes a lot of education work, a lot of trying to explain things in terms that everyone can understand, which is also challenging, and trying to find where that common ground can be made or when you just can't do it and you have to move on. So one thing that has been very new for me is that I am currently a trustee for the board of directors for the National Gallery of Canada. And I joined that board at the exact same time that they appointed the new executive director, Sasha Suda, who I think is trying very, very hard to do very, very challenging but amazing work. But for me, watching someone in a leadership position attempt to implement things or attempt to go forward and bring those kind of change mandates into these major systems has been fascinating. Like watching the system itself and its structure almost inherently make effort to reject those efforts. Hiring policies on a federal level are defined, on a very large scale. So to go and change and implement policy yourself becomes having to go against the tide. And it definitely doesn't feel to me like there's effort being made across the spectrum as much as there's pockets of effort where there's people trying to do good to fight systemic racism. And then there's people that are almost intentionally being silent during this time to avoid responsibility. And that's where I'm at. That's what I've been trying to work through. I wish that this session was about a week from now, because I could make some other comments about a new appointment that, I got a job, but I can't announce what it is yet. So I'm very excited about that. But, I'd love to tell you all that I'm going to do some great things next. But until I can get into it further, I can't. So I'll stick with my personal practice as well, which on a on a social level, a lot of my circles, as opposed to jumping into those big efforts the way I outlined, being a trustee on the board of directors. There we go. On a social level, I've noticed a lot of people of color, a lot of Black people, and a lot of Indigenous people focusing more on their circles around them directly, and a little less about getting involved in some of the larger needs that are being expressed. And partially because a lot of the people that I work with have been doing this work for a long time, and then therefore, when an organization has, say, over the last 6 months expressed a need to suddenly start doing work, there's sort of a backlash that's happened where I'd rather work with the people that I've already seen the commitment from prior to the media explosion that has happened. And therefore, I've found very polite ways to try to pass off people onto others, or express to them how coming in the middle of a crisis and abruptly needing to do a large amount of work requires a crisis level of pay scale for the people that are going to do that work. Because you can't say, I've got $500 and I need you to fix the racism within my organization. It's super racist to do that. Sorry, I'm laughing. It's not funny, but it happens way more than you think. And maybe that's a great opener where I kind of leave it into some terrible ways of saying how the environment's a little bit hostile, a little bit screwed up, and maybe we can hear from everyone else. And I'll definitely fill more time later by answering some questions.
Does anyone have any questions or comments they wish to pass on to Clayton? Again, if you have them, please send them to Kevin, and he'll bring them up in the conversation. Kevin, anything?
Nothing's coming my way. Nope.
Okay. We'll go on to our next, and we can return. Oh, there's a question. Sorry. Go ahead, Wanda.
Just because I can jump in here. And Clayton, you didn't talk for 15 minutes, so give me a second.
Yeah.
Throwing everybody's time off, Clayton.
Yeah.
Just because I know your work in the artist run kind of world, and, you know, this kind of do-it-yourself kind of way of being radical on the ground, and then working in these ways with negotiating, strategizing at national levels and through institutions. What do you take from one place into that other place?
So what do I take from the national place into?
No, the more artist-run.
Oh, absolutely.
More larger institutional spaces that you currently operate in.
I mean, on a personally, I don't know how many other people apply this themselves, but I try very hard to be very frank and direct. And I think that's because working with artists and with community, you have to be clear about why you're doing the things you're doing and what your intentions are and how you're going to go about it. You can't do all those sort of political niceness that is talking around an issue to avoid the subject. You have to be telling the people you're going to work with what you're doing. So when I go into Ottawa and I'll say, you know, I don't want to hear about how great someone is while they're being accused of being a racist. Like, someone can be great at something and be a racist. That doesn't mean that they're a great person while they're being accused of something. Like, there's so much that, you know, it's so hard to have to tell people those kind of things, and it has resulted in people not wanting to talk to me at all. But then there's times where I'm constantly trying to also be direct with care, where I'm not doing things maliciously. I'm not trying to hurt someone's feelings. There's been so many instances, and I think we were on a panel once, Wanda, where I said, why is it that when I'm being critical, but I'm trying to do it to help someone, that they're getting defensive? Like, I'm only putting effort in because I care about you. Like, if I don't care about somebody, why am I going to help? Like, you need me to tell you about how terrible your policies are? I could just walk away. You know, like, the rest of the world's going to move past all this without you at that point. And that's really what I think a lot of people are starting to realize is that the issues that are being raised right now in regards to, the issues specifically around Black Lives Matter and the protesting that took place in the middle of a pandemic, I think are a wake-up call that, if you haven't been doing this work, you do need to be ashamed of yourself. It's really needs to be done. It has to be there. And it's like, maybe a little bit of tough talk is hurts someone's feelings, but at least it gets them to snap out of it. So, yeah.
All right. And from that response, we have a question. And the question is, not knowing what your new position is, what do you see as your first responsibility as a leader in the new circumstance?
Oh, wow. To keep it as short as possible, to start saying that representation isn't a choice, it's a necessity. And that spaces have to be spaces that are going to bring different representational groups into those places have to give them the ability to succeed. So it isn't just creating a solo position that suddenly has a job description, but also has a silent cultural job description added to it, or suddenly is doing twice or at sometimes 10 times the labor of someone. So it's that way. It's like that idea of saying, if you're hiring an accountant and you hire an Indigenous accountant, are they suddenly an Indigenous accountant? And does that mean that they're paid more than an accountant because they have another title added to their work? In Ottawa specifically, I've heard a lot of government employees who do not want to have those identity politics thrust onto them and have their jobs suddenly change because they've been almost conditioned over time to see how damaging that is for the individuals involved. So it's not just bringing more people in, it's also making room that they can explore and redefine those environments for themselves so that they can have a coexistence within that. And it's going to be very challenging for all parties. So the amount of work that those people coming into that environment have to do, that's the level of work I expect from the people that already work there. So, if the bar is getting raised across the spectrum, it isn't just, we've hired a new Indigenous administrator for this department, and then they die by 1,000 cuts as the hundreds of white administrators around them commit so many microaggressions that the person has nightmares for the rest of their life. It can't be like that. It has to be better than that.
And there's another here, one that has sparked the flames. Do you have any advice for collaborations involving Indigenous and non-Indigenous artists that are just starting up?
Oh, wow. That's especially if that's an interest where an Indigenous artist wants to work with non-Indigenous people. I think that being clear and being very communication heavy early on. I've even heard of people making like memorandums of understanding or like treaties with each other to outline roles and responsibilities so they felt comfortable in what they were going to move forward with. But I mean, collaboration is like saying forming friendship in a way. It can be formal, it doesn't have to be friendly, but that Indigenous person taking that work on is taking on a lot of labor. I understand that the non-Indigenous person is as well, but it's similar to any kind of give and take. Like the mutual benefit to each side has to be really clear the whole time, and it can't become exploitative, definitely. I mean, and then there's the other conversation, which I think that question brings up, is how is a non-Indigenous person supposed to approach cross the line to be like, how do I work with Native people? But for me, I think again, those collaborations should happen organically. If you're pursuing this, there's a bigger question of like why are you pursuing someone without knowing who they are? Like that's huge. And for collaborations, those relationships should be really meaningful for you. It shouldn't just be, I'm working with a Native person. Like that's super weird.
You good? Okay.
There's another
One
here.
more. Okay, go ahead.
And one last one. is this the right place to ask a question? My question is, who is doing it right? And what is it about their practice that is worth lifting up in our communities? And so I'd ask the question here as well from the person. I'm not quite sure we're clear on what you mean by what they're doing, and what do you mean by which practice are we speaking of? So maybe some more clarity in that particular question would be required for him to answer in a more specific way.
Well, I guess I can, instead of citing an instance where like I'm naming someone that if you went and looked them up, you'd be like, oh, I'll just do what they're doing. I think, again, you have to find people to work with that are aligning with your worldview, your methodologies. You can argue, but you have to argue in an environment that makes people want to come back and sit down and argue again in the future. So in the end, like, collaborations have to be from a place where people can tolerate working together on an ongoing basis. So to say who is doing it right to implement, say, from an organizational standpoint, artist collaborations across cultural barriers, I don't have an answer for that. I think that there are a lot of people trying to do that kind of work, and I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all conversation. I think that when I program people from different places beside each other, it's because I've seen the connections with them and gotten consent and done the legwork involved. I just don't think it's the kind of thing where I could put a call for submission out saying I'm looking for Native folk and Black folk to work together, or white people that want to work with people of color. Like, it's just such a strange formalized way of things that I just think there'd be such a backlash against that kind of idea that one size fits all. It doesn't. You're going to have to make it work for you. That's the only advice I could really offer.
Thank you, Clayton and Kevin, and those who had questions, comments. Please keep the questions, comments coming into Kevin directly, and we'll bring them up as we can. Our next speaker is Wanda Nanibush.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Clayton. You kicked it off in the way that I was hoping you would, just kicking some ass. But in that gentle, firm way that you do. I have a really bad sex joke that I wanted to make there, but I won't. But it is Thursday and things get sexier as you get closer to the weekend, you know. So we're talking about indigeneity and its representation. I was kind of stuck by the title, because that's what happens to me. Because I think indigeneity is like this word that we're batting around right now, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. I'm really kind of struggling with it, because we've worked really hard to nail down the specificity of our nations and the specificity of where we're coming from and our different governance practices, our different histories, our different ways of operating, making relationship, all those kinds of things. And we're still working hard on that, you know, getting people to know the different languages, the different nation names, this kind of thing. So indigeneity is another kind of monolithic way of looking at all of us. And I think the only entry point for me is because I think we hold on to the word indigenous partly because of its connection to land. So when I think about indigeneity, for me, the entry point would be land as like the way in which all of these things are related to specific parcels of land, specific places, and specific histories within those places. So that's where I think into this question. The second part of it is the representation. And I think in terms of myself, there's so many pitfalls with the idea of representing or being represented. And I'll talk more specifically within the gallery situation, because that's where I am right now. Or at least it's one of my hats. I have so frickin' many. But when I think about I don't think of myself as representing all Indigenous people. I can't, it's impossible. But I represent, in a sense, the will and the sovereignty of all Indigenous people. I can say that in the sense that whatever move I make should be opening that space for any nation to walk through. So I think of it in that way, which is a really more almost performative and imaginative space, because we don't have our sovereignty intact in this country, except in the way in which we enforce it and perform it and do it and act on it in a daily way. And so when I come into, and this relates to what you were talking about, Clayton, in terms of how we approach these institutions, how we approach these conversations. And I've been writing this essay for Heather, Iglo, Liorti, and Carla. So I'm struggling with this language of sovereignty in the arts context, because it's definitely where I'm coming from, but it's so tied into all this like Western thinking on sovereignty that we don't want to be a part of, and definitely avoiding like really dangerous nationalisms and things like this, especially in the world that we live in today. We can see very clearly how dangerous nationalism is, and xenophobia, and it's not an Anishinaabe way to think about the world. And so if I'm going to perform that, then I can't think that way. So I've been struggling with this. I definitely, at the AGO, I mean, we went just straight into the nation-to-nation relationship and straight into thinking about treaty. And what does that mean? And performing an imaginative exercise as if it's still something operating and that we can operate within that context. And I say it's imaginative because we all know these treaties have been broken, and we have to address that kind of history and the current situation of how much it's being broken right now. As, you know, COVID is happening and everybody was, you know, in lockdown, we had some of the biggest protests across the country, you know, against the pipeline and against this extractive economy. And then suddenly, you know, all of this machinations are happening behind the scenes while we are all trying to stay safe at home, you know. So these things are very real and very present, and I don't separate at all those concerns from what we're doing in the gallery. And if they're not connected, then I believe that art isn't relevant. Our work is not being relevant. So I ask a lot of questions about these things, and we can like hammer it out together. But I do think that thinking through what sovereignty is in the context of a museum or in the context of the arts work that we do is really important. And how do we connect to those movements, and how do we connect to the concerns and daily lives of the people that we come from and that we love and that we live with? I don't stop being like, you know, who I am when I walk through the museum doors, although you are asked to stop being who you are when you walk through the museum doors. And I think that's the number one issue, right? There's a class issue there on top of a cultural issue, and those things dovetail. So one of the moves, I think, is that if we are going to do this work, we also have to think about what our cultures would do in that situation, right? What are the philosophies we would take to that conversation? So I think as an Anishinaabe person, but I've also learned quite a lot from the Haudenosaunee, because they're just so kick-ass with their sovereignty and holding on to their governance structures in a way that we have kind of failed in a way. So I think, no offense to my own people, babes, we're doing good things too. But we can learn from each other, you know, internationally, like between our nations, on how to do this work. And so I think those are the questions I ask, right? Like, what is the philosophy of relationship, right, that I want to carry into my work inside the museum with audiences and all that kind of stuff? So I'm always double checking like our responses and whether, you know, it fits an Anishinaabe worldview. And that worldview is always constantly changing and constantly adapting. I have lots to say, but I'm going to actually, around the question of interpretation or representation, I think that something that I really work hard at is being a bit more open with that idea. So when I walked into the gallery, you know, I have a sense that the main audience really does still see us in the past, you know, authenticity in the past. There's these really old ideas that are still floating around in people's brains You can just see the reaction to changing the name of Indian Church, that people still have a really emotional investment in settler colonialism in a way that, you know, these changes that we're making hurt them, like hurt their sense of who they are. It hurts their emotions. And as an Anishinaabe, you know, I need to think about that when I'm doing this work. I don't need to, like, you know, take care of anyone through that process, but it's something to be thought about and understood, because we are all human beings, right? And also to understand how deep this kind of settler colonial thinking is in people's bodies and in their lives, and how we are just trained in it. And I mean Indigenous people as well. We're also trained in that same system. We go to those schools, we go to those universities, we work in the system. We cannot pretend like we have not adopted some of this bullshit, and that we need to get rid of it too. So I want to move to poetry. So there's this poem by Esther Berlin, and I'm sorry, especially looking at you, Charles, who reads poetry so brilliantly and writes. I want to do it anyway, and I just hope that she's not listening and I don't butcher it. But it's bluesing, and she's a Dene artist, Navajo artist, poet, also visual artist. Bluesing on the Brown Vibe. And Coyote struts down East 14th, feeling good, looking good, feeling the brown, melting into the brown that loiters, rapping with the brown in front of the Native American Health Center, talking that talk of relocation from tribal nation, of recent immigration to the place some call the United States. You can put Canada in there too. Home to many dislocated funky brown. Ironic immigration, more accurate tribal nation to tribal nation. And Coyote sprinkles corn pollen in the 4 directions to thank the tribal people, indigenous to what some call the state of California, the city of Oakland, for allowing us to use their land. And Coyote travels by Greyhound from Albuquerque, New Mexico, USA, through Deneta to Oakland, California, USA, laughing. Interstate 40 is cluttered with RVs from as far away as Maine, traveling and traveling to perpetuate the myth. Coyote kicks back for most of the ride, amused by the constant herd of tourists, amazed by the mythic Indian they create. At a pit stop in Winslow, Coyote trades a worn beaded cigarette lighter for roasted corn from a middle-aged Navajo woman squatting in front of a store. And Coyote squats alongside the woman talking that talk of border town blues, of reservation discrimination. Bluesing on the brown vibe, a Bulagana snaps a photo. The Navajo woman stands holding out her hand, requesting some of her soul back. Instead, she replaces her soul with a worn picture of George Washington on a dollar bill. And Coyote starts on another ear of corn, climbing onto the Greyhound, the woman still squatting, waiting, tired of learning not to want, waits there for the return of all her pieces. And Coyote wanders right into a Ponca sitting at the Fruitvale BART station. Next to the Ponca is a Seminole. Coyote struts up to the two. Where y'all from? The Ponca replies, Oklahoma. Pause. The Seminole silent watches a rush of people climb in and out of the train headed for Fremont. The Seminole stretches his arms up and back, stiff from the wooden benches. Pause. He pushes his lips out toward the Ponca, slowly gesturing that he too is from Oklahoma. Oklahoma. Coyote wanders. Whereabouts? The Ponca replies, Ponca City. Pause. The Seminole replies, Seminole. Coyote gestures to the Ponca. You Ponca? The Ponca nods his head in affirmation. Coyote nods his head in content to the Seminole. Coyote asks, you Seminole? Pause. The Seminole, now watching some kids eating frozen fruit bars, nods his head. And Coyote shares his smokes with the two. And 10 minutes later, they travel together on the Richmond train, headed for Wednesday night dinner at the Intertribal Friendship House. And Coyote, bluesing on the urban brown funk vibe, wanders in and out of existence, tasting the brown, rusty at times, worn bitter from relocation. So I'll stop there.
So Wanda, we have a poetry reading coming up, and I would really like to. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you. Kevin, any comments, questions?
Not at the moment.
Okay. I'm interested, Wanda, that route you've taken to tell story, motivating behind that, because I find sometimes, we get so linear in our way of speaking, we don't spark imagination or leave openings to other ways of expression. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is why I'm in the arts, is because I believe that very strongly that it has a different way of looking at the world and a different way of expressing itself that allows it allows for a kind of nuance and a kind of opening to the future that other discourses don't. This is why it's a essential thing to life and happiness. I almost felt like I was going to do the American thing, life, liberty, and happiness thing. Yeah, I think that's part of it, but also thinking about very deeply about the way that Anishinaabe people think about learning. Like, how do we learn? How do we learn our histories? How do we understand our identities? And again, this is my practice of trying to bring Anishinaabeness into everything I do. It means that I have to think about knowledge making and knowledge doing differently. And story is the main way that we do this. And story, also, there's an opening in story. You know what I mean? There's no fixity. So meanings just keep opening up more meanings. And there's a freedom of motion and movement in that I think is super niche. That I want to continue. And it's an entry point for other people to grow and change as well themselves, which I think is great. And I think that poem, there's something so mundane in it. And sometimes I think what we're trying to bring to life is this kind of the mundane of our culture in a way that, it's not all like fucking, shaking tents and sweats.
Thank you for that. I do have a question has come in, Wanda, and it is this. What role can, and the person had the gallery, but I'll be change it a little bit to say, what role can a gallery have in extending its reach into communities, allowing participation, interaction, and representation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's something that I've been wrestling with in terms of how we make these motions into community. We bring community in the doors in a number of really stated ways, which is like, to have our work on the walls brings people in the doors. When people can see themselves in the work that we do and in the visual space of a place, for sure that brings people in the doors. The fact that we translate into different languages, Indigenous languages, is also something that has welcomed a community of language folks that I'm interested in working further with. Events like the Seal Feast, where people can come and actually do something that we do in the community, but right there inside the institution where it's virtually impossible to do, but obviously not impossible, My colleague Georgiana Uliarek worked really hard to make sure we could get past all those kind of bureaucratic bullshit that we have to do our community stuff inside the museum. So I think that breaking the boundaries of what a museum is the first thing, like changing our idea of what it can do, what it performs, what it is, and making it more of a community center is one of those ways. But that's bringing people in. And one of the things that I have a problem with is because everything is so much about budgets and different silos, sustaining those relationships with community is really hard. And I'm somebody who believes in building a community that is sustainable. I can't say I can do that at all at the museum. Like, that is not something that I've been capable of doing. And it's making me rethink, future stuff. We can get to that. But so I think that there is a barrier there. For some of the things I'm developing right now, which hopefully the Canada Council is going to help me with, is I want to bring in Inuit curator as well. So I'm not the only person, and we have a huge collection But that person can live in community. Like, they do not have to be in Toronto. Some of the stated things that I would like is that they, you know, they speak the language, because the language actually opens up the work a lot more. So trying to find ways to decentralize the museum, decentralize our work so that people can live in their own communities and do this work. And also, it's a conceptual shift of thinking about Indigenous work inside the museum as belonging to the community, held in trust for the community and communities, is a conceptual shift. And that's the one we're working on right now, is sort of wrapping our heads around what does that mean legally? What does that mean in all kinds of ways, ways that I don't really give a shit about, to be honest. I care more about the fact, this relationship between the work and the people who in my opinion own it. So I think about that as the museum as well. The museum is owned by the people. It's not owned by a foundation or anybody. It's owned by the people. And so if we think through that and what that means, I think we would reach community a lot better. Yeah, and I think if we loosen some of the rules around things like food, I think we could get somewhere. I know that's not a total response, and I'm only answering within my gallery work. I have other work where I do community-based practices that are very different.
Thank you. Any other questions, Kevin? Oh. Thank you, Wanda. As always, deep and insightful. And you can see from the chat boxes, the first two speakers have really moved us into a good space, expected. We move now to Emma. Over to you, Emma.
I'm here. You can find me. Hi. So my name is Emma Steen. For those who don't know me, which is probably all of you. I'm a European Jewish and Anishinaabe descent curator and writer, and I work for the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective here in Toronto, which is my hometown. And my position there is I'm the Outreach and Membership Coordinator. So I kind of approach this panel and the topics around Indigenous representation and like issues within in the Indigenous arts right now, kind of through two different programs that we've been working on and that I've been working on at work at the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective. So the first one is a fund that has been going on for the month of July. And the second is an accountability program that I've been developing. So the accountability program was really inspired a couple months ago when there was a huge rise of like local just individuals who started tracking the amount of mostly Black artists who are present in private galleries. That came out in Toronto, it came out in Ottawa, it was kind of across the country. People were really looking at where, like who is selling, who is showing art by Black artists and also Indigenous artists and BIPOC artists in general. And I'm not an artist, I've always been like behind the scenes, and I'm so interested in the ways in which galleries profit off of the labor of Black Indigenous people of color. So I really want to look at not so much who is being shown at galleries, but who's actually being like paid to be inside galleries. So I started contacting this like public galleries across the country, as many as I possibly could get the email of, to ask pretty just like outright, like how many Indigenous people are you paying and what are their positions? And I think, as probably a lot of people can imagine, the numbers are quite small. And the answers I was getting was a mixture of people being like, oh, we have like this many people who like we get grants for, and we have like one person who's full-time paid. Or we have, you know, 2 people on a contract and no actual people who are like a part of the institution. And then also emails being like, oh, we would never ask someone that. And I'm like, we know what that means. Means there's no people of color working for you. So that's really made me start thinking about like the gig economy that Indigenous and people of color, especially in like the arts, are consistently subject to. Working freelance, working off of contracts and grant-based, and that seems to be the vast majority. And that's really been heightened because of COVID, because all of these contracts just suddenly ended and a lot of people were suddenly just like out of work. And the folks who mostly aren't out of work are people who are paid like full year contracts by institutions, by arts institutions. And it really made me think, you know, how much can there actually be, how can there be change happening? How can there be any kind of possible institutional disruption without like internal disruption, without actually paying Indigenous people, Black people, people of color to enter your institution, but also stay there. And I think that's what I've been finding so complex around grants and contract-based work is that I think it's amazing. I definitely have like benefited from getting on a grant or getting on a contract and getting to meet new people and getting to work, you know, while I was in school, short-term projects. But when I left, I don't know what's happening there anymore. And I think that what often is conveyed is like, you want to have me there, you want to have our community there, but you don't actually want to like financially invest in me. And that's a really important distinction between not only how much are people able to do while they're there, but also how comfortable they feel there, how accepted they are at large. When we can't actually like look at an institution and be like, you have all this money and you're allocating it in a whole lot of ways, but you're always choosing to apply for grants when it comes to hiring Indigenous people. And that's like, yeah, a really clear, massive distinction kind of across a lot of public galleries and private galleries across the country. And as I said, this was really made extensively clear because of COVID. So at the ACC, we have been working with the Canadian Council for the Arts, the Canada Council for the Arts, as well as a few other Indigenous organizations, national organizations, to start this fund. We called it Community Cares, because the ACC has been very like care oriented this past few months and all of 2020. That's really been where we've been directing our work, is around the idea of care and taking care. So Community Cares started, and pretty much it was a fund where all you had to do is apply. You had to be an Indigenous arts professional. We would ask a few questions to make sure that people are self-identified as Indigenous, that they self-identified as an arts professional, that they have lost financial opportunities because of COVID in their arts profession. And after that, really, like, that's all we need to know. We trust that people are going to be coming to us in good faith. And each amount was $1,000. And the responses we were getting, we were able to give it to, by the end of it, I think we're still rolling out a few payments, but by the end we'll have over 450 individuals who received it. And the idea was we were going to announce it at the end of June, and then all the way until September, there was going to be this pocket of money open. And we announced it on a Friday, and by Monday we had 300 applicants. And by Wednesday, we had 500. So what was supposed to be like a multi-month, all summer long fund for people to apply to was over in a couple of days, because the need is so high. And the gig economy we are consistently subject to is so detrimental, especially for Indigenous folks, where we are brought in and then sent out. And like I said, it was just made so clear. And the conversations we were having with these individuals, because we spoke to every single person on the phone or on email, like back and forth, what we were hearing was just like, this doesn't sound real. Like how could this possibly exist? Why hasn't it existed before? And like, what's going to happen in the future? And so that's really made us look at the state of affairs for Indigenous artists, for Indigenous art professionals and curators. So we're right now pushing the government to have an accessible form of consistent funding for Indigenous arts professionals going forward. We'll see what happens, but I think that probably all arts professionals have really experienced the challenges of institutions who, yeah, they love our aesthetics. They love their like allyship pat on the back, and then they get to see us leave and they don't have to think about us after that. So these are the things I've been really focusing on is like, yeah, accountability within institutions, looking at who is paying people, who is keeping people paid, like retaining hires, which is also a huge issue, because I think both Wanda and Clayton really touched upon this so beautifully, is that institutions are often like not places we can feel safe. We don't necessarily always enter them and feel welcome or like we can stay. And yeah, things like global pandemic really makes you like sit back and take a bigger like breath and be like, oh my God, this like capitalist system of just like colonial white supremacy is destroying us. And we are so subject to it, we're not even able to take a minute and see what's happening. So that's where my work currently is lying, is thinking about how do we hold institutions accountable when it comes to hiring and retaining and paying Indigenous arts professionals, and arts professionals being like the broadest possible term I can have at this moment for like any Indigenous person you're bringing into an arts institution under that scope. And yeah, how do we make sure that going forward, we are not only seeing ourselves inside these institutions, but that we can actually start having interior disruption to make change. And that's me.
Wonderful. Kevin.
Thank you. There is one question here. What changes would you like to see overall in granting organizations / structures? Is it possible to get outside of a consumer-based models of application and of measuring success?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question and a long question. So I'm going to try to remember it while I answer. I think it's really hard. I think that we are really, really dependent on the system that we're in, even though it doesn't serve us. And so I don't necessarily know if I have like, these are the changes that we need. I think it's really systemic and really layered in the ways in which we are reliant on grants, and the ways in which grants can be amazing, and also the way in which they limit long-term relationships. So here's what I would say. Grants in general need to be designed and put out by the communities who they're for. Like, period. Because I think that issues that we see time and time again, especially in arts grants for Indigenous folk, is coming up with a whole lot of issues around like status and government identifications of Indigenous people, which is just like a whole other can of worms. But bringing members of the community into the grant writing process and the grant creation process before it's released is so important. And then thinking about institutions working with grants and individuals, I would say like really investigate how you consider like reciprocity in relationships in labor, like what you're asking of people. I personally do not believe in like short-term relationships. I don't think they make sense. Culturally, they don't make sense. And personally, they don't. I think that if I want to work with you, I want to work with you for years to come, or at least be invested in your work and you're invested in mine for years to come. I don't think it makes sense to have any kind of labor or work or whatever that is like 4 months, 8 months, and then it's just done. Like that just, even if you have like a project that has a deadline, that relationship and that working relationship shouldn't be over, because I think for a lot of young people especially, it just becomes like, now what? This ends and I start a new one and then that ends. I start a new one and then that ends. And you end up just being in the same position. You don't have the chance to grow in the same way. You don't have the chance to actually do any serious change that often we're brought in to do. So those are the kinds of topics I would say like fall within institutions and grants. And I don't even remember if that technically answers your question. So I'm sorry if I went off.
It does address a lot of the questions. The questions are coming into you multi-layered with many aspects. So I'll also be mindful of that. Emma, can you speak to how we can move this knowledge of the Indigenous being moved in and out? How can we have more transparency with these colonialized institutions? And that's probably, let's say, the first part of that question.
Can you repeat the first part again? I
Yes.
didn't hear you very well.
I'm reading directly from the person's question. Can you speak to how we can move this knowledge of the Indigenous being moved in and moved out?
Okay.
And how can we have more transparency with these colonized institutions?
Okay. I don't really know how to answer that first question. The Indigenous being moved in and out, and maybe someone else will like take this up just because I don't necessarily know. But what I would say when it comes to transparency in institutions, I personally am like really pro public shaming. If you are a public institution, that means we are paying you. Our money, our collective money, our resources are going and paying these institutions. So we have the right to hold them accountable publicly, to tell people, tell each other, tell your friends how much you're being paid, tell people your bad experiences, your good experience, and then let's like put it out there. This accountability program that I'm building, I'm gonna hopefully to be developing some kind of like map so that we can actually start looking at the country and seeing where like what institutions are safe to work at for Indigenous people, which ones have no racialized staff at all. And I think that if institutions start to know that not only are we talking to each other, but we are like talking shit to each other, then transparency just kind of has to follow, because no one wants a bad reputation. And that's up to us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It's great. You also went right directly into what was the latter half of that particular question. I have one more for you, which will be the last one for this round. If you have questions, you can still leave them. We're documenting them, and we'll have them posted hopefully on CPAMO's page in many ways, and or responded to by the commenters. The question here is, what are ways for institutions to invest in long-term relationships, knowing that many artists are engaged on a project basis?
Yeah, well, I think partially, don't even think of it so much as just artists, but like the curators, the technicians, the tour guides, the people who are working just like in your institution at large. Those should all be long-term relationships that are based around benefiting and growing that individual. So if they leave, they're gonna leave with like only good things to say and hopefully taking a lot of wisdom with them. And if they stay, like, great for you. Everyone wants to be able to say that like we have like a long-term retaining policy. Like people love to work with us for years. In regards to artists, small scale things can be like, what kind of residencies do you have? Do you have a residency that brings people into it? Do you trust the artist to like control their own space? Do you trust the artist to, you know, work independently? What does it mean to extend longer than the assumed length that we're often given when it comes to projects, like 4 or 8 month contracts? These tend to be things that like individually institutions start to reconsider. So really just changing the way that you're bringing people in and hoping to continue to work with them. If it's an artist, you can also just like have a conversation with the artist and like say like, what can we do for you? How can we make this like a reciprocally beneficial relationship, and how can I continue to support you afterwards? Because artists will tell you, we will always tell you, have these open conversations, let people know you're having them, because people want to be able to share their needs and want to be able to talk about what works and what doesn't. So I would just say like really like open communication and take things partially, like do like interior work to start addressing that, but also look at just transparency in general and ways that you can start to more publicly support your own staff and the people who you bring in.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Emma. And thank you again to Clayton and Wanda. We're going to move on to Ashley Bonberry.
Okay. Sego sewa gwego nyawa gwego. Ashley Bonberry Youngets. I'm Ashley Bonberry. I'm Gutnyaha Wolf Clan from 6 Nations of the Grand River Territory. I predominantly work in theater, a little bit in film, and now currently an arts administrator, artistic administrative director at Cata. And Yeah, it's a pleasure and honor to be invited for this conversation. I wanted to just touch on like a little bit of my experience in working with Indigenous theater, and like some of the things that I've encountered, or you know, just questions or thoughts to put out there for those who work with Indigenous artists, whether you're in theater or not, dance, performing arts. But for those who are non-Indigenous, it's just like learn about the land that you're on, wherever you are in this world, in this entire world. Learn about the land that you're on. Who lived there? Who lives there now? You know, what are their names? What languages did they speak? What were their values? Where are they now? Why are they not here? Yeah, like when I have meetings with non-Indigenous folks in Toronto, it's like I'll sit in a room with predominantly white folks, and my question to them is, okay, so you're doing a land acknowledgement. Great. It's on your email tagline. Cool. It's on your website. But do you know who the Haudenosaunee people are? That's my people. But it's not a people group, it's a confederacy. There are 6 nations that make up the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Can you name any of them? You live on this land and you're given this land acknowledgement, but can you name any of the Haudenosaunee nations? Someone will raise their hand and say, Ojibwe? Like, no, like we need to learn a little bit more. Like it's performative, or it's virtue signaling if we're not doing the work to learn more about who actually lived here. Why are we saying thank you? What are we thankful for? Actually, what are we thankful for? We get to live, thrive, and work on this land, and the people who lived here before are no longer here. So what does that even mean? And how are we giving back? And then that comes into like, yeah, just working with, like for Indigenous theater to be or for Indigenous performing arts to be in like predominantly white institutions or spaces. There's a whole lot of there's a whole lot of walls that we have to break down. And it's like, you're on our land, like you give us a little bit, you know? But it's their policies, it's their procedures, it's you know, there's a whole lot that we have to battle to break through, to just even have like human respect and decency where we shouldn't have to beg for it. So just like allowing us to have sovereignty within our own rehearsal spaces and for performance, and, you know, just like, the amount of like microaggressions that happen towards Indigenous folks walking into those institutions is really, really heinous. And predominantly I work as like a stage manager in those spaces. So it's my job to protect everyone there. And so I'm the one running into the battlefield against people who are like, well, let me write an email to Joe and he'll get back to you in a week. And I'm like, but we need the fire system shut off now so we can smudge now. What's your smudging schedule? Guess what? There is no such thing. There's no smudging schedule. You need medicine when you need medicine. So like accommodate those things like it's needed. And it's just like, when you're working with Indigenous folks, I'm not speaking from like pan-Indigeneity, because, you know, like smudging has become kind of like a pan-Indigenous like process, and it's not how my people use medicine usually, but like I'll adopt it and I'll use it when it's there. But for the safety of everyone else in the room, they prefer to smudge. Let's do it. But I mean, for every different Indigenous production that you're going to have different values and traditions and protocols and processes, and there needs to be flexibility in creating and understanding. And also, it's like, train your staff, please. Train your staff, have anti-oppression training, have anti-Indigenous, anti-Black training, because it's so deeply embedded into our racial bias that we don't even know it's there until you have that training. And it's worth the money if your staff knows they get to take that home to their family and they train their family and their kids, and that it's only better for the next generation. And that's, you know, the teachings that I come from, that Indigenous people come from, is like, we look back for the 7 generations behind us, but we're also taking care of the 7 generations in front of us. And so the care that we do for like community care, community support, it is for that. And so I'm not just asking you to shut off your fire alarm so I can like cleanse my head, or, you know, it's creating safety for everyone so that we can have a beautiful, positive rehearsal space. And like, that is part of, you want, you as the institution hiring us for a show, you want the show, but I want the process. And that's the thing, is like that the beauty is in the process. There is pain in that process. There is medicine that's needed in that process. And we need to be able to work together. When I say I need the fire alarm shut off, just put it off. And don't tell me that I need to give you a schedule for it. Yeah, there's, for every different nation that walks into your building, there's cultural and spiritual safety that needs to be taken care of. And you won't always have someone to lead you and guide you, but at least if you have some kind of education and training, it can lead you into a beautiful place where we can build community. And it takes that bit of educating yourself. Don't ask me to teach you. Please don't ask an Indigenous person to teach you, a Black person to teach you, a person of color to teach you. Guess what? There's the internet. Guess what? There's books written about it. We can teach ourselves and educate ourselves on how to be kinder, how to have harm reduction, how to, you know, how to be, you know, learning what microaggressions are. What are the things that are your triggers? What are your reactions to those triggers? And how are you being a respectful and kind person to an Indigenous person when you're on their land? And also learning about the generational trauma that through like epigenetics is just like, it's in our DNA and we can't fight that. So when you bring unwarned, really traumatic stuff into a rehearsal space without creating just create safety in your rehearsal spaces is what I'm saying. I've experienced a lot of really difficult rehearsal spaces that I was not warned about that they would carry as much. Yeah, I'm just jumping all over the place because I wrote down all of the notes in no wonderful order. Also, I think it's really important to create training opportunities. We need more Indigenous people in leadership, in the key roles. We need training. Like if I could be an executive director of an organization or something that would create great change, I would do that. I don't have that training. ED, AD, director, producer, Indigenous folks for IBPOC folks, like we need that. But it's not really there. It's not abundant, but we need the funding for it. And so we're talking about Indigenous framework being a circle, but we have to jump through the hoops of the hierarchy. And it just really, we can have as much transformative change within this circle and within a rehearsal room and create a show, but we still have to do this. And it's unnatural to our ways of knowing and ways of being. To decolonize a system means to dismantle that system. So how do we dismantle patriarchy? How do we dismantle capitalism? Like we're in the midst of it. Like we're in COVID. How are we making ends meet? What are we doing? Other than understanding that capitalism hasn't served us. So how do we move forward from here? In what good ways can we make great art, whether there's funding or not? What was it? Patriarchy, capitalism, and colonialism. How do we dismantle those? And how do we create art once those things are dismantled? Like you can't say I'm going to decolonize any spectrum of society, because it's a key word, it's a hot word, but understand what that word means, and that it comes with a cost. I turned my air conditioning off and now I'm sweating buckets. And then just to jump into some of my like arts admin stuff, but be relational. If you're working with Indigenous folks, if you're working with anyone, be relational. It's easy. Learn how to respect yourself and respect other people by building relationships and not just expecting your worth is worth only what you can produce for me. I don't work that way. Yeah, educating staff and volunteers on Indigenous values and ways of knowing and ways of being, accessibility needs, all of that. Look at your mission statement and your values. Go to your next event. Look around the room. Who's there? Who's not there? Why aren't they there? Who's taking space in that room? Why isn't this a space that feels safe for those who are marginalized and racialized? How do you create a safer space for them? And again, this goes back to what I think has already been stated, but it just needs to be restated again and again for those in the back. Don't rely on the one Indigenous person you know to find you like an elder or another speaker or a person for your board. You need to build a relationship. You need to be a part of community around you. You have to be a part of it, and it's an actionable term. Yeah, no, and this is again. So I'm often hired for like arts admin jobs, but because my lived experiences working with like equity, diversity, inclusion, I end up doing that on top of my arts admin stuff. And I'm not getting paid for the extra. I'm just expected to know it. So like, hire an arts administrator if you want an arts administrator. Hire someone for EDI if you want that specialized knowledge. Don't expect me to work 2 jobs for the one price, because it's a lot, because I'm still doing that one job and then also giving you my knowledge, my lived experience and knowledge. Embrace intersectionality. That's it's what we need. And then I think I'm just going to end with this last one. Sorry, there's just random notes. But presencing Indigenous voices. So if you're going to hold an Indigenous show or have an Indigenous event or whatever, don't top and tail it with the non-Indigenous producers or whatever. You need to keep Indigenous presence the entire time. Yes, we want to hear from the producers. Yes, we want to thank the funders, but I mean, really, really make an effort to like pay someone or to have it be a part of the show as like a meaningful way to continue to thank the land, continue to thank the knowledge that's been shared. Presence Indigenous voices. I'll end with that.
Thank you, Ashley. Kevin, any questions?
So far, no.
There was one that I saw in the chat box, and it's one here I'll just read. There's an interesting question of separating process and outcome. Can you talk about what the implications are when you prioritize one over the other? Is one question. And then another question that came with that, is it a contradiction to desire decolonization and fear the dismantling of institutions and practices? So let's go with the first one. What are the implications when you prioritize process over outcome?
Oh, process over outcome. I thought I heard prioritizing one over the other. I'm like, it's called white supremacy. Process over outcome. What kind of outcome are you going to have if you aren't valuing the process? Like the process is where you get to just like, that's where you take things apart and you understand what the intentions are and what's inside of you, what needs come out, what needs to get poured back in, and how do we work as a team? How do you need to have trust built when you're working with any team. You need to build trust, and you can't build trust just walking into a room being like, here are the words, you know. You can have a beautiful show by just learning the words. I mean, go to any Stratford show. Just kidding. But I think that the part of the Indigenous process is to, like, we need to have ceremony. We need to get to know each other. We need to have medicine in the room. We need to value each other. We need to have check-ins. We need to understand each other's vulnerabilities. And, you know, how are you doing today? How can I help you? How can I support you? That's part of the process that, like, you can't get to work if you're triggered by something from earlier that day and you need to, like, actually just talk about it. And, like, yes, we all have our own therapists and there's time and space for that. But I mean, like, to have vulnerability within your own group it's a really special and medicinal place. And so to value the outcome over there is no outcome that's worthy of my time without the process.
Thank you for that. Some questions are now coming in. This one will be a comment first, followed by the question. It's a little bit long, so bear with me. I'll try to also read fast or speak fast as I normally do. Thank you for raising land acknowledgements. Sadly, the practice of land acknowledgements have become part of a checklist at theater performances. Without personalizing them or having a deeper understanding, they have become meaningless. I watch audiences and they frequently don't listen as the land acknowledgements are being said. And as there is no connection, there is no generic. There's no connection, it is so generic. There is a lot of confusion. I believe the community wants to do better. During this time of a pandemic, there is a time to do this work for when theaters come back, whenever that time will be. Do you have any suggestions for companies to begin on whom to work with? We cannot continue to call Native Earth Performing Arts as some kind of hotline every time a theater company needs help and advice.
That's great. I'm sure they're tired of that too. I mean, I did a thing. I worked with the Canadian Dance Assembly, and we wrote a grant together, and I did I coordinated a immersive cultural competency tour to my community in Six Nations, and we spent time with all spheres that we lived on my reserve. We spent time with different spheres of society. So we spent time with elders on the land in like a reconstructed like 1700s longhouse with plants, with medicine, culture keepers, with athletes, like it just like different, and dancers. Like I taught them as much as I could about who my people are so they could understand we're not just Mohawks, we are the Six Nations, and we're all diverse, but we live together. And it was a lot of learning, and microaggressions will happen, and there's just, you know, we do the best we can. But I mean, there are ways to learn, there are books to read, and that's the one thing I would recommend. Just start with reading. There's so many books. And like, rather than relying on a person or an organization to teach you, like everyone wants the wisdom that, but it's not like that. We've been here for millennia, and you want us to give you a 5-minute, help us make a land acknowledgement. It doesn't work that way. Thank you.
There is 2 more, but I think we probably only have time for 1. I'm also struggling as an arts admin to advocate for compensation for my lived experience slash EDI facilitation. How do you start that conversation when you're already working there in an institution and already doing the work?
You have a meeting and you just talk about, this is in my contract, whatever's in your contract, and then talk about the work that's happening outside of your contract and say, this is what I get paid for my EDI work on the side. This is my hourly wage, or this is my day wage or weekly wage for the EDI work that I do on the side. So how can we make this work for the work that I'm already doing for you plus? And it does mean self-advocacy. You're already advocating for so many other people, so advocate for yourself.
Thank you, Ashley.
We have time for another question.
I think so.
Okay, so the question is the perceived dichotomy of process and outcome a byproduct of Western binary thinking? Do you feel?
Short answer, yes. Yeah, no, it definitely is. And that's the whole thing of just like, you know, you're only worth as much as you can produce. And so just, you're hired for this, this is the amount of time, give us a show. And so that is very of the colonial mindset. And that's not the way that we work. We have to have generative conversations. We need to be able to break down and cry together and heal together. And then that's when you trust the people on stage, and you trust your director, you trust the producer, you trust your stage manager, you trust whomever is on your team, that we're all going to have each other's back. And those are Indigenous values.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ashley. That was a beautiful segue to our next speaker, Aria Evans, and a wonderful follow-up on the speakers who've come before. Love that notion of trust and being open and vulnerable when in process. Yeah, the chemistry there is magic. Can we, Aria, where are you? Somewhere. You're up.
Quay, hello. I'm Aria Evans. I think that gender is a colonial construct, so you can use any pronoun for me, she, they, he, all are great. And I come from a mixed background. My father is Afro-Indigenous, which means that he has the Mi'kmaq and Black combo that happened in Nova Scotia, and I have settler from my mom's side. And I am a mover and a maker. I work mainly in contemporary dance, which is a very white-dominated field. And I've been, similar to you, Ashley, I've been taking notes, and I think I'm gonna just kind of like popcorn. There have been so many incredible things that have been said that I'm just gonna kind of like jump into. I'm also somebody that loves to ask more questions as a way to answer things, and I like look forward to how that opens our perspectives. Yeah, so I think like having a mixed background, I find myself as a bridge between different experiences, and I think a lot about what indigeneity means. I think about all of the times when somebody has asked me, like, how does it feel to be an Indigenous artist? And I think about how identity is tied to artistic practice for BIPOC folks. And like, is this something that we can talk about with our white artistic colleagues? Like, are we asking them if their identity is exactly tied to their artistic practice? And does being Indigenous inherently make my work Indigenous? Or am I only making Indigenous work when I engage with like Indigenous philosophy, worldview, or stories? And can those things actually be separated from the work I am making, however that looks? And I think that like I'm considering this, but I think this is something that like everyone across artistic fields should be considering, like the curators, the institutions. Like what Wanda was saying about Indigenous being a blanket term, and this idea that there's a breadth of experiences inside of indigeneity. I think it's also really interesting to question what is Indigenous work, and how do we want to showcase the span of all of the different expressions that we are making. Like Keith often talks about braids and buckskins and like going beyond that, and what is a like contemporary representation of indigeneity. And I think for me as an emerging artist, it's somebody who is at the beginning of wanting to be a part of representation, I think about what that can look like. I think also, like, I'm an artist. I work for other people, and I also make my own work. And specifically inside of the contemporary dance world, which is like, it's again predominantly white run and predominantly white led, I think about how I cultivate space inside of the creative practice, inside of my personal creative practice, and like why is it that I keep wanting to have spaces that I'm making for myself as opposed to working in other spaces, in like white run spaces. And I think about, again, this like idea of reciprocity. How are we finding ways that everyone feels safe and supported? And again, like, I'm asking a lot of questions, and I have ways that I like to work. And I think about what we have to give up inside of a creative process to make spaces that feel safe and comfortable. And like check-ins, time, rethinking how we use time, not necessarily being product driven right away. I think about how presenters want to know what something is going to look like before they program it. And I think about if we are inside of process and we are working with the artists and we are giving space and time for artists to like bring themselves and to dive deep and to be vulnerable and to not project what it is that we're going to be making, and to not be like, to be present, to be in the moment, which I think is something that COVID is also contributing to. How can we be more present? But there needs to be a conversation that happens between like presenters and how we market work. Like, if I'm valuing artists, I don't necessarily know what my work is going to look like, but a presenter wants to know what they're going to be presenting. And how do we value a different kind of outcome so that artists can really give the time and space to each other to make the work that is like coming from an authentic place. And that's something, like, I think about how we market dance, and because it's a body-based practice and because it's tied to form, when I think about indigeneity and I think about like BIPOC representation, we all have different bodies, we all have different forms that we are connected to. And there isn't one way to tell an audience what they're going to see. And I think that if we can build understanding with like presenters and then also audiences, that is actually something that is like should be celebrated and is valuable, that we can like move further beyond the constraints of this sort of like westernized lens that I feel really caught inside of. I think about, I'm thinking about the relationship between like institutions that work with artists and how they are the bridge to audiences, and how I'm often invited into a festival or a space, and like perhaps I am the like diversity card of like, oh, this artist that's like working with people that come from different backgrounds, and how do we prepare audiences to have different cultural understandings of what they're about to see, that it's not enough just to like invite me into a space to show my work, but that there is a responsibility, there is a like relationship building that's necessary for audiences to really like get a sense of and an understanding of the work that they're about to see. And I think this is something that like institutions and organizations can do. And there was talk about, like Ashley was saying, COVID-19 is giving us time, it's giving us like institutions and organizations have the time to really like look inward and reflect and think about what they can do. And this is something that feels important. Like, what are you doing to facilitate the relationship between the artist and the audience so that we feel supported and we feel safe? I think what Ashley talked about, like, where does a land acknowledgement go beyond a statement and turn into actions, is really, really interesting. I think about, like, I remember in the dance community in like 2015 doing a land acknowledgement for a fringe show, and it felt like this was the first time I was seeing a dance show that had a land acknowledgement, and how many people from that land acknowledgement reached out to me saying like, oh, a land acknowledgement, like, what is that? How do I do that? Can you like send me what you said so that I can say it at the beginning of all of my shows? And that is not enough. Like, we can't just continue to replicate and repeat land acknowledgements. I think about the things that we're afraid not to, the things that we don't know, that we're afraid to say that we don't know, and how much we need examples of like doing the wrong thing just as much as we need examples of how to do the right thing. And this idea of like silence holding us back from action, it's not getting us anywhere. Like, I want to see people making mistakes. I want to see people saying the wrong thing and doing the wrong thing with humility so that we can move forward from those places. And I don't know everything. I make mistakes, and it's important that we have space to have examples of like trying something and being like, oh, well, that didn't work. The act of silence to avoid responsibility. And I think like there's this idea that saying nothing is better than saying the wrong thing. And I think like artists and audiences are asking for change, and inside of change, like I think about the term growing pains. Like, we're going to go through growing pains. We can't be afraid to make mistakes. Emma was saying something about like right now during COVID, who has work and who doesn't have work during COVID, and how are we, like, I'm questioning, how are we redistributing those funds to support the artists who are the soul of our industry? And like, I think about like the first month of COVID where all of the things that I had mapped for like a year and a half just got like completely taken away. And I think about the institutions that do have positions where people are on like contracts, and like where are the funds going? I think like it's interesting to think about like, what is a development project? I think right now a lot of artists, like a lot of my peers, are sinking into this idea of what can we develop? What ideas can I start dreaming about? But I also think about development outside of like creative pursuit, and what does that look like inside of nurturing relationships? Like, how can funding go into building longstanding relationships that like adds into this idea of long-term accountability and reciprocity, that I don't want to work with somebody once and never see them again. I want to build these relationships, and right now, because we have the time, what does that look like? And I think that would be an interesting place to see like the redistribution of funds go into. I think I'm going to talk, I'm jumping into so many different places, but I'm going to talk a little bit about representation. Because I think in dance specifically, we are a body-based practice. We're not necessarily activating language. We're not necessarily activating oral storytelling. And I think that we need representation in all forms. I think about contemporary and traditional forms, as well as hybrid dance forms. I think about body type, and I think about colorism. And representation is so important. And I think, like, I ask, how do we do that outside of tokenizing bodies? Or how do we do that outside of only working with Black, Indigenous, and people of color who fit into a Western aesthetic that then just kind of like check a box on the outskirts of what it actually means to show different art forms, to take out this idea that like ballet is the center of all techniques. How do we celebrate the breadth of our bodies? And I think like this is a really interesting thing that I recognize inside of like indigeneity inside of the dance community, that like, what is it to be white passing, and what is it to like quote unquote look Indigenous? And like, again, this goes back to the question of like, what does being Indigenous mean? What does that look like? And because an audience is only reading bodies on stage, they're not necessarily like, they don't necessarily read our bios, they don't necessarily like listen to us introduce ourselves. How do we again like build that relationship with an audience so that they understand what they're seeing, so that they can understand that like all of these people are coming from different perspectives, from different backgrounds? And I think about like, what does that look like inside of live performance? Again, like I don't personally love Q&As, but I wonder like, what is another way that we can introduce our artists to an audience so that there is an understanding of who we are about to engage with. I think when I think about live performance, the thing that I miss the most is getting to know someone or seeing the intricacies of how a body moves through space or how we express ourselves. So I'm questioning what that looks like inside of like performance structures. How do we actually get to know and like build personal relationships with the artists that we're seeing on stages? Yeah, I'm really questioning, and I think this is like a presenters do better. Like, how do we create room for multiple aesthetics inside of dance spaces, and inside of like singular dance performances? Like, I think that like the collaborations that I've seen between like Indigenous and non-Indigenous, or like white and like BIPOC artists, when we look at like different forms, it's very much like my form responds to your form, and there's still a separation. And I really think about where we come together and how we create bridges inside of artistic disciplines, and then how that's also valued from like a presenter's perspective without it being looked at as like less than or less interesting, or like of a less, like not as high quality as a dance performance that has a certain kind of aesthetic that is true the entire time that you're watching a piece. Because I make my own work, and because I also like work for other people, I think about like where I feel safe taking my work. And I think about like seeing people in leadership positions who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color in like all aspects of an organization, and how when I can see that an artistic director is also BIPOC, when I can see that like a stage manager or somebody who's working as a technician or the like administrators are like include BIPOC artists, I automatically feel safer, and I feel like I can trust the organization because they're putting they're bringing people into their organization in a way that is institutional and structural, as well as like the artists that are coming in. And I think that is just like, that just needs to be the norm. That needs to be like, there should be no question that is how things are. Yeah, I think it was Clayton who was talking about this at the beginning, like the work that some Indigenous artists have been doing for a long time, and how like some people are now just like jumping in and wanting to be a part of it, and how do we like continue to acknowledge the work that has been done, and like our elders who have been paving the way, and how right now it feels like we're kind of just like jumping into something, but we really do need to like support and acknowledge those that have been doing this kind of like decolonizing anti-racist work for a really long time, because I think also with like social media and the attention that COVID has put onto social media, it's really easy to forget about the history that we have of getting to where we are inside of these conversations.
All right, I think we have some questions for you.
Great. I'm just like, I could keep talking. I have way more notes, but yeah, questions.
One of the first questions coming in is, how is slowness part of your practice? Is there Mi'kmaq Black senses of time that influence your process?
I don't know if I would specifically say like the idea of time is tied to my identity, but I do think that like the product capitalist way of using time is what I'm trying to work against. That inside of this exchange of make a piece, send it out to get presented, present the piece and it's over, doesn't actually feel good. And it doesn't feel connected to like a worldview that I'm more interested in embracing, which is my like Mi'kmaq and Black ways of seeing and using time. I think, but I think it really is just about values and morals. Like, I want to value the artists that I'm working with. I want to give space and time to work through the things that come up that are challenging. I don't want to force anyone to do something that they don't want to do, and I want to build agency inside of the relationships that I am reaching out to, that I really want to embrace and nurture. So for me, it's about working against the colonial mindset of time, which I think innately aligns itself to like a different part of my identity. But like transactional art is not something that I want to engage in. And I think, again, like, how do we build relationships with audiences and presenters so that they can also understand a different kind of value around artistic practice?
Thank you. Anything else, Kevin?
No, there's nothing else on my end.
Thank you, Aria. Oh, wow, this just gets, yeah, there's Jesse, right? Cool. So we have Keith now coming on. Keith, wherever you are.
I'm right here. Quick way, everyone. Keith Barker, Indigenous. I'm Algonquin Métis. My ancestors come from Mattawa in the Golden Lake Reserve area, but I was raised in Treaty 3 territory. First, I just want to acknowledge any elders that are on this call. Indigenous, non-Indigenous, just want to a shout out to all that. Just to the work that you've done and work that you're doing. And also wanted to just acknowledge two people we've lost in our community recently in the performing arts is Daniel David Moses and Sophie Morasti. Just two very big losses in our community, but I just wanted, I feel like they're with us. So I think, you know, in these conversations, these are two people that would be asked to do these conversations and have volunteered many hours of their time to make sure that we're all sitting here talking right now. So just wanted to acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge that I'm a male my privilege that as a male, but also my white passing skin, that, you know, that I think that's an important part of just acknowledging privilege and then using your privilege to support other people. I first learned that, I just have to acknowledge David Stevenson, who is the CEO of the Moosehide campaign. About 5 years ago, I heard him give a talk about it, and this is the first thing he said, and I was just blown away by that. So just wanted to acknowledge that's where I got that from. And just a great reminder all the time. I'm just going to speak from my perspective. I think Wanda is really great in articulating that, you know, that we're not monolithic. Everyone has a different experience, a different life experience, and everyone's coming from a different place. And so I can't speak for other people, and I really try not to. I really try to just make sure that I am always speaking from my own space. So these are my opinions, and yeah, I'm accountable for those. And but yeah, and I think I'm just going to start with the fact case. So I'm the current steward at Native Earth Performing Arts, just to get a perspective here, which when I took this job, this is what I come to understand. Native Earth is 37 years old. It's Canada's oldest professional Indigenous theatre company based in Toronto. And you think about that. It's our oldest professional Indigenous theatre company is only 37 years old in this country. Also looking at, you know, if you look at other theatre companies that started at that same time, I'll take as an example Necessary Angel, and you look at where the funding went, it's a dramatic difference. A lot of that comes down to precarity. A lot of like Indigenous organizations move from rent to rent when they can't afford places. Like Native Earth has had many homes. One of them being the distillery, Bathurst Street, the Native Canadian Center. Like it has moved, and in that has always been penalized. Whereas other theater companies who have artistic directors that are there for 20 years have a good wage, and then have time and staff to support them so they can go off and supplement their income and make more money. Whereas a lot of the artistic directors who run culturally specific organizations, oftentimes long hours in a supportive role, and then do all that other work outside. And Aria mentioned that, you know, this idea that people call Native Earth a lot, and I don't mind taking those phone calls. That was just part of the job. That was part of the job Yvette said to me, that Tara Began said to me, Ryan passed on to say, the phone rings and you have to answer it, and you're serving community by helping people connect with artists, with dramaturgs, with directors, with plays, you know, with, you know, casting calls, everything. I get everything, and that's okay. That's just part of that job that I inherited. But this is the other thing. So Native Earth runs Aki Studio, which is in the Daniel Spector building in Regent Park. And it's such a cultural hub. It's really quite a blessing to be in that space with so many different communities. We learn a lot constantly. But Canada Council a couple years ago said to us that we were the only urban Indigenous theatre space in Canada. That's, you know, and to me, like, maybe that's not true, maybe there are other ones, but if that is the case, or if they can say that you are one of them one, that's also very disappointing and really upsetting. That just shows you. There's also, last September, Creating, Knowing and Sharing, which is Canada Council's is its Indigenous funding body, as all the different sections. All the multi-year clients, the Indigenous companies across Canada, all met, and just to talk about the program, what works, what didn't. And all the multi-year clients fit in one boardroom. And you can't do that with any other kind of field. So it just tells you how small, and lots of them were new. So when the Canada Council actually looked at the number of multi-year clients, Indigenous companies across Canada, it was very, very small. I remember seeing the list, it was shocking. And so Creating, Knowing and Sharing was put into place to address very, very glaring issues. And so we all fit into one room. And Jesse was visited us and gave us a talk at the time. But it was like, the other thing that dawned on me at the moment was there are actually 0 Indigenous institutions. That's when I think I think it's over $2 million. Your budget's over $2 million. Like in that room, 0 institutions. And Clayton had actually talked to us about that too, about the realization there are just no organizations like that. So it was just like, so these numbers are shocking, and in a lot of ways underfunded. And so to me, it was like when we're looking at when organizations, when we partner with organizations, oftentimes it's about resources and support, and it's about how we, that's how, lots of the work is the only way it makes it to the stage with supports like that, and allies. And I would also say that multi-year companies right now, so we're in this weird place where multi-year companies that are showing new commitments to Indigenous work have also received, then they receive the economic support, and they actually receive more of it, more than the marginalized companies that are actually been doing the work for a long time. So they get rewarded because it's like, oh, look at what they're doing, look at how they're connecting and engaging with Indigenous artists, or with the BIPOC community. So here, this institution gets more money, and in actual fact, those other smaller organizations see less of that. So there's a reward for that, which is acknowledged, and lots of organizations tell us all the time. And then when I get to, for me, is like one of the biggest glaring moments, the thing that is needed most right now is training. A number of years ago, Heritage, we had a meeting, CIT, Center for Indigenous Theater, Native Earth, Margot Kane, and Full Circle, and that were Indigenous companies that were doing training in terms of for artists and that. And the metrics, we didn't fit the metrics because they didn't have enough numbers. It's not like a George Brown College that 30 students come a year, 18 graduate. Those are numbers, and the Heritage can get behind that kind of training. They said to us, like, your numbers are so low. Like CIT had 4 students this year and 3 of them graduated, or 2 graduated, and for the amount of money we're putting in, it doesn't equal, and I can't remember who said it, it may be Wanda, that's our money, is what is the response back in the room. It's like, you're holding our money, it's our land, these are all the resources that you've benefited from, and then you hold back even the training. And so the training was actually pulled from Native Earth, and this is before my time. But it was a huge impact, because for almost 10 years, no training through Heritage happened. And now, when the new funding model comes and people are being asked to engage with more Indigenous designers and directors and actors, no one's been trained. And so there's a very, very small pool of Indigenous artists that are working all year and all the time. Because there's no one with that's received that kind of training. And all you have to do is look at any theater school or any like Humber that has a production aspect and training. If you look at the last 20 years and you look at the students up until a couple of years ago when things started to change, before that is there no Indigenous students. And part of my privilege, I trained at George Brown as an actor, but I often wondered, like, if my skin was different color, would I have been accepted? That's just part of that. And that's, so to me is like, right now there's a huge push, and the problem we're seeing is that people are being vaulted into positions that they're not ready for. Lots of other people in mainstream theaters have been like groomed, trained slowly, learning things as they go, or they went to a top private school and then they, like, are trained and have that, that buoyancy to learn and get into a position of power. And then, whereas I find that there are people being vaulted in positions, and when they fail, people have actually said to me, like, see, we tried, but it didn't work. And so to me, it's like, it didn't work because there are no supports around that person, knowing full well that they are we had someone graduated York and had a full stage production as a designer 6 months after graduation, and no other graduate. It's because that person, Indigenous, quote unquote. So and they are super talented. We love this person. I'm not saying that it's not because they're talented. It's just that all of a sudden, and then sitting in my office and starts to cry because she says, like, I just feel overwhelmed, and I feel like everybody is asking for something right now. And I hate saying no, So I've said yes to too many things. So then we walked this person through everything, but you could see they could break. And if they didn't have support, and they didn't have support, how that, there's a burnout that just comes. And so to me, training is such a massive, like to any artistic director across Canada, for theater, I don't know, art galleries or multidisciplinary dance companies or whatever, it's like, they all often ask me, like, what can I do? And I say, well, what BIPOC person is taking your job next? And what are you doing to train them to get them to that place? Because that's it. It's like, you need to be mentoring, bringing people up, training them to understand something like Excel, or understand what arts administration really is. And, you know, because, you know, I'm guilty of this too. I had this idea of what an artistic director was, and what it is very different. And that shock, but then also the learning curve is huge. And thankfully I had Isaac Thomas, who's my managing director, who had all that, he'd been through 3 artistic directors in six years. And so like knew the training of like, well, you're new, here's what I did with the last person. Like that was the, and has been patient with me in my learning curve of that. So to me, I was like, I can't even imagine someone going into a predominantly white institution going like, I don't know what I'm doing, and not have an Isaac with them that goes, okay. I've also had like Yvette Nolan, where I can call her in the middle of the night and say, what do I do? I don't know what to do. And have had people in community, you know, Jenny Lozon, Monique Mojica, like to acknowledge those people, just say, hey, don't worry. It's this, you know, you're going to be that. It's going to be okay. So to me, it's like, what is the training? How do we support people as they move into these positions so that that they're successful? So, you know, I think that that's a major part for me. Is like, the thing right now that I'm worried about is the fatigue issue for mainstream organizations. I'm on phone calls with all the ADs across Toronto. When the pandemic hit, one of the amazing things is that for the very first time, 31 artistic directors from across Toronto, all in a room together. People I actually never see in public. First time all of us sitting around talking. But the things they're talking about, that the worry was that there's a fatigue involved with Black Lives Matter, Indigenous Lives Matter, and what happens, what's that wave after, that negative wave that comes, like that we saw in Canada 150th, where everyone was doing an Indigenous project, and the next year just kind of fell off. Some of them picked it up, but there was no more funding, so they were on to other projects. And to me, it's like, the thing I'm seeing with a lot of those people is that people are scared as opposed to uncomfortable. So there is and I find that it's a difference. Like, we are consistently saying, like, you need to start being okay and be okay being uncomfortable in uncomfortable conversations and that. But I feel that people are scared or are afraid. And in those situations, they don't want to say anything. They don't want to say the wrong thing. They go on to start telling me how terrible of a human they are and all the things they've done bad. I'm like, it's okay. I don't need to know that. But, you know, like, to me, it's like, I don't know how you shift from being afraid and scared into just being uncomfortable. And just like some other people have said here, literature about white fragility, there's a great book about that. Like, there's all kinds of great literature just to start reading and to ease that. So that's one thing. And to me, it's like, and this is a couple weeks ago, I had 2 students reach out to me from a major institution in the city of Toronto who were BIPOC, one Indigenous and West South Asian, and they called us to ask us how they address it with the training institution, a major university, because they asked their professors, what are you doing to create safe space for BIPOC people? And they were like, scared. Backpedaling, I don't know, and I don't know what that means, and, you know, this is a longer process, and they immediately got their backs up and got really upset. I know that there's elements of like being outed in public, and the people are scared, and so they were really, and so these students come to us saying, we got no answers. They seem to be upset with us about it. There is some racist behavior happening that needs to be addressed, and we don't have the framework to actually address it. So it's kind of like, everyone's doing that. I think we're just going to walk by and not see it, and maybe this thing will blow over. And so we had about a 2-hour conversation with these, and when they emailed us back, and I'm not saying this to blow like, oh, look what we did, but they said, you're the first people to speak to us who validated our position. And that made me sad, because that shouldn't just be us all. Literally, we were saying like, well, you just need to use the university mechanisms, like a formal letter. I said, start privately. I don't think going on Facebook solves anything, because you're going to start a conversation that will go out of control. I said, but if you want to address this with them, start with a private conversation, start with a formal letter. Like, we went through all these processes that they could do, and said, but these are your decisions and you can do it as adults and as growing your own practice. Like, but if you need any advice or you want anything, come back to us. So that's happening in a major institution right now, to second year students. And how do they address that? And people have very little understanding around what to do. And that just that becomes more and more. And because people are so busy, in the past, they just haven't, there's just nothing in place for them to do that. So, and this is the thing I'll say about lots of Indigenous work that I'm seeing right now, that I find work is effective because so many people are being asked to teach institutions and companies around issues, around things like Ashley was saying. And Ashley, I've been in places where Ashley's taught people, like at PACT and that. These are like major companies, lots of non-Indigenous people just wanting to engage and learn and come with an open heart and are really excited to learn, and I get that. But I actually find that there are artists out there now whose work is about teaching and not about just being art. They're not being given the permission to just be an artist, to just normalize Indigenous stories. Like, someone wrote that to me recently. It's like, normalize Indigenous stories. It was like, yes, like just a normal love story. Like, how many love stories are out there that isn't teaching anybody anything? It just exists in its own world. Like, that's the exciting thing about some of the artists I'm seeing coming up, is that they're just going, whatever, and they're actually starting to do that. But I'd say a lot of work is in this teaching place right now, which is like, and why, of course it would be, because they're being consistently asked in spaces of being the only Indigenous person to teach or to correct, or if you see anything that's out of, like, please say something, they're like, okay, and then they become like that person. And I just want to end on saying is that I love this, like mistakes. We make mistakes all the time. That's the thing, is that I do not think Native Earth has made a lot of mistakes. I've made a lot of mistakes. One mistake I will say right now, that is just, everybody is different. You can, someone shows up and you're like, hey, we set up a smudge over in the corner and we did whatever, and they can go, it's not my practice. I don't smudge. So to me, it's like, then you haven't had a conversation. It's like, have with the person in front of you, how do you like to be identified? Like have the real, like, be relational with someone. Like, what do you need on first day? Like this or whatever. And we were guilty of it, Native Earth. I did an Australian Indigenous artistic director come for first rehearsal of my play. And we were so busy. It was the first week of rehearsals. Everybody was in the, we were all in the mode of production and all in that busy mode. And this person came, was in our space, and the communication was off and something went, and later when I sat down, I took her for a coffee and said, well, what could we have done better? And she's like, I needed to be welcomed, and I needed to be brought to the water. It was January, so that would not have been, but I didn't ask that. And so I learned, and we're relational. We have a long-standing relationship. It's not a one-off. Like, that's the whole thing about Native Earth for us, is like every time we engage with people, we don't want a one show, one off, that's it. We make sure that we always have at least 2 to 3 productions or relationships within the art with people, so that it isn't a one off. To me, it was like, we learned right away, and that person and I could be very honest with each other. Like, I was just on a Zoom with them 2 nights ago on another project that we're doing. And so we're working it out through the work together and through our relationship together. And she laughed about it after. She goes, you know what? I probably wouldn't have wanted, you would have got me to the water and I would have froze my ass off. Like, that was a dumb thing. But she goes, I really felt at the time that's what I needed. And maybe we would have driven up there and I went, no, I'm not getting out of this car right now, Cherry Beach, to go stand and freeze my ass off in the water. But I didn't offer it. We didn't talk about it. And it was like ceremony. What is ceremony to people? What are, like, and that's the big thing at Native Earth, is we just ask everybody, what is your ceremony? What is the thing you need? Or if there is nothing, I'm not going to assume that you're going to do something or not do something. All I'm going to ask you is, like, what do you need? And hopefully we have built a relationship long enough that someone can just be honest with us and talk. And if we don't have that, to me is like, then we haven't done the work to be relational with each other. I think that's it.
Thank you, Keith.
Yep.
Kevin, over to you.
Okay, at this point, there are no questions.
Excellent. I suppose, I think that was really clear. Let's move to Jesse, and then we'll come back. There may be some questions that come up for Keith. Then, as I said, after Jesse, there'll be some questions for him, possibly. But we can open it up to the full panel, whoever wishes to ask any of the other panelists questions.
Ani, bonjour. My name is Jesse Wente. I'm Anishinaabe. From Toronto, my family comes from the Serpent River First Nation and a small community called Chicago. And I am currently the executive director of the Indigenous Screen Office. And as Charles mentioned, I have recently been appointed as the chair of the Canada Council for the Arts, the first Indigenous chair in the Council's history. I have served, just to give you the quick summary of the Wikipedia page, I've served I've worked in the media and cultural sector of Canada for almost 25 years. I have a long-standing relationship with the CBC. I was also sat on the board of both Imaginative and Native Earth Performing Arts, where I was president for quite a long time, and was very eager to help them get into the Aki space, because I recognized how important it was for our important organizations to have the same as the other institutions have, and that was space. And I just have to say, before I go any further, I feel frankly really blessed to have been invited and included into this conversation with so many incredibly brilliant people. I felt like I've just sucked it all up and learned so much just in 3 hours. And so for my formal remarks, I'll just say ditto. No, I think that would be a cop-out. But I would just echo everyone else's really wonderful remarks. I guess I'll do the uncomfortable thing for an Anishinaabe and talk about myself just for a brief moment. I guess in terms of where I'm positioned now, my day job is building an Indigenous-led organization for the Indigenous community, run entirely by Indigenous people. It is my first time leading an Indigenous organization. I say that having just said I was chair of Native Earth Performing Arts. So scratch that exactly, and instead say it's the first time I've built an Indigenous organization from the ground up, because I like Keith inherited Native Earth from many wonderful people. And I will say it's been a lot to do it. I will give you an idea. So when we were founded, when the ISO was announced by the Heritage Department in 2017, after roughly 20 years of advocacy, so it happened, but after a lot of extraordinary effort, the annual budget for the Indigenous Screen Office was $235,000, which covered me and my travel, basically. And you know, I would admit, and I will try. I will be generous with my partners, because many of them are still partners at the ISO, and say that it maybe wasn't their intention, but certainly in practice, it was very much what I think we see a lot of the time in Indian country, which is we were funded just below subsistence level. And I think set up very much with the idea that, hey, if it fails, well, we hired this guy that everyone seems to like. And if it fails on his watch, well, then we've really tried and we can just wash our hands of the whole fucking thing. And so I would say in my response to that, because I didn't, you know, I took the job knowing that that was exactly what was going to happen. So in the first year, by the end of the first year, I doubled the budget, and we now have 4 staff and a couple of contracts. We are in the midst of dispersing $3 million in COVID relief funding, which went to those Indigenous companies and artists who are falling through the cracks of the other COVID relief funding. So we've, I don't have the, I'm sorry, I should have brought the actual numbers, but we're right around like 1.4 dispersed out of the 2 million that we'd earmarked for that relief funding. We will be launching more programs, so keep your eyes out for that. And in terms of the philosophy of where I think the ISO is going, it's interesting to hear, and frankly, a relief and very reassuring to hear a lot of what has been brought up, because it thankfully sounds exactly like what we're doing. And I should say, that's because we are, when people ask us, I say the ISO is sort of constantly in consultation. We don't go in cycles in and out. We are just, that's what a community-based organization is. You're just always in dialogue and conversation with the people that you are meant to serve and that you are meant to represent. And so we try for all of our programs to very much be grounded in what we've heard and to serve those needs. And that includes the relief fund, but also how we imagine growing the organization in the medium or long term. We have a proposal in front of the Heritage Department, which, if I'm honest, COVID interrupted, I think. And so we're hoping that it will be addressed whenever the government returns an actual budget, which I'm sure everyone knows is likely this fall and likely to take the form of some sort of stimulus budget. So we certainly are pushing very hard for Indigenous creators and storytellers to be represented in that effort. And we actually think that there is no such thing as a recovery for any sector if it is not done equitably. And that includes bringing those that have been left behind for generations, that they actually have to be the front of the line when it comes to recovery, because that is how you'll truly recover a sector, a culture, and a country, is by doing that. I will say, and I'll just flop very quickly, and sometimes I do this, when it comes to Canada Council, I've already made it very clear that my vantage point is that we need to pressure for a universal basic income for all, and that this is actually the answer for a lot of the issues facing sustainability for artists, but it's actually the answer for a whole lot of other people as well. And we need, but that it is not alone. We also need a much deeper investment in supports that go along with universal basic income, because we can't just see everyone get a universal basic income, but then an erosion of the other supports that exist. And frankly, to be sort of really macro political, I think we need an entire rethink around how we prioritize how we spend community money, because if perhaps it's been the most obvious cases in the move to defund police, which I think is a wonderful solidarity movement because it is effective for pretty much every marginalized community, but especially for Black and Indigenous relations. This is a goal our communities wholeheartedly agree is a good one. But it's not just defunding the police. It's actually examining all of the infrastructure to support capitalism and so-called free markets that actually should be redistributed to support free people instead, because we don't have free markets. So let's stop fucking pretending and instead free the people. And so that was the Canada Council. In terms of the ISO, the pitch that we've put forward is what we call the Story Fund. It is a multidisciplinary fund. It's centered on story, not on whatever format that may look like. Because I believe that funders have to begin to be much freer in terms of what artists are creating. And to someone's point earlier about presenters always wanting to know, I think it was Aria who said presenters always want to know what it's going to look like. When I was a commissioning curator, I would see the art like the day before it became public. I would never know what it was gonna be. Like, I thought that was, I ignorantly thought that was the point. That, like, that, you know, who am I to tell the artists what to make? Give them money, go create. Like, I remember commissioning, we gave a big bunch of money to Tanya Tagak to commission a new score from the Nook of the North. The first time I heard it was in the rehearsal the day before the performance. And my notes were, oh, hey, that's great. They'll love it. You know, I think we need to stop all of that sort of stuff and just be freer. And that the Story Fund is meant to do that and meant to allow the artists to really tell us the funding. So if 1 year everyone wants to make a feature film, well, hey, that's what we'll fund. But if the next year everyone wants to make a video game, well, we'll fund that then. I do think we need, it's tough in the screen sector because the art of the screen sector was never separate from commercial interests. It was, in fact, an art created specifically to serve commercial interests. So to unpack some of that, I think will be challenging. But I also think we have to recognize Canada's place in what is a large industry when it comes to that sector and realize that Canada as an industrial player is minor when it comes to that. And our greatest impact is actually in the art we create. And if we stopped imposing commercial imperatives and metrics on success, we'd actually achieve what everyone wants, which is artists that have long-term careers and do all that stuff. And there's all sorts of models, including the way some of our funders used to behave, to show us that that actually works if you do that. And one of the other things we want to make sure that we're looking at with the Story Fund is investing in infrastructure for Indigenous artists and groups, and specifically community shared infrastructure. So stuff that isn't meant to then allow one company or one person to create a whole thing is really about what can we invest in that can be shared by multiple communities, multiple people, serve multiple people's best interests, but will also make us more sustainable for the next crisis, because the crisis we're in today is just this chapter. There will be one later, and we do need to become more sustainable. And I think a lot of, and that's in the arts, but also in general in our society, we need to be investing more in collective good and less in individual success. And like Wanda, I hope to create, I've spent my career trying to create space that any nation could walk through, that it's not about that is the Anishinaabe way, that's sort of how we imagine the world should be. And so I try to bring that all the time. I try to make sure and insist that the ISO lives in right relations with the people it serves, but also that I hope to help the Canada Council get to where it can live in right relations and be better at what it does. And I mean, one of the reasons why I took the Canada Council position, and I spent a long time discussing it with my circle about whether I should even do it, because I find it still, frankly, uncomfortable to be the chair of a Crown corporation. But I felt that they're open and ready for change, that they've been trying hard since I've been on the board in the last 3 years, that there is an opportunity for them to do more and to be leaders for not just this sector, but for other crowns, to show them how this can be done. Because we also, cultural crowns touch all of us on this call, but all sorts of crowns touch our people all the time, and they can all behave way better and begin to live. And I guess part of that is because
touching us there, Jesse.
Yeah, they should just stop touching. Yes, ideally. But I mean, I think, Wanda, for me, it's an acknowledgement that we are here now. And so, like, as we build the future, we have to make this more livable in the present. And I think that's why one of my big philosophical changes around how to work within colonial institutions is that I've switched. I don't think they will decolonize. I don't think that's possible for them to decolonize. I think they were built actually quite stably to resist that impulse. And so instead, I don't believe we can totally abandon them, because I think they continue to exist. So we can't pretend that they won't. So while I'm trying to build this thing for our community that's by our community, and will exist for them. I felt it important to take a role like the Canada Council to try to really, I see that work now as harm reduction. And that what we do when we engage with crown corporations and try to help them is to try to make it more livable for our communities to move through those spaces, because our communities will want to, they may need to, they deserve to be able to do those things. It is our fucking money, all of it, all the time. So like, that's why also I'm not afraid for the ISO to ask for that money from the feds, because it's ours. And and I try to work in a sovereignty framework all the time. I talk about narrative sovereignty because I think that's what I'm not a politician or a lawyer. So I'm a story person. And so, but I also would say that narrative sovereignty is central to how we are going to regain and reconstitute our physical and political sovereignty. And that if we actually examine how colonial states operate, specifically I'll use Canada as an example, without their own narrative sovereignty, what claims would they actually have other than possession? Right, their presence is really central to their claim. And then the other part of it is, well, we'll keep telling the story about how we're sovereign and we're real and you need to acknowledge us. And guess what? Like, generations of people believe that. And so I think it's important for our, in a cultural sector that is built to serve Canadian narrative sovereignty, that Indigenous people receive our own, which means give us the money, and to be polite, fuck off. And let us run it. We'll figure it out. We have, look at the incredible talented people I'm just staring at my screen. These people can do more with it than the government can. And I think we just need to make that space and demand it, and make that space in those institutions while we build ourselves up, so that when we can divest ourselves from those, we are ready to do that. And Keith brought up a great part about training and mentorship. So one of the first things the ISO did was we partnered with the great colonial superpower that is Netflix, and we took their money and we put it all into mentorship and training for mid-career artists to really gain them the experience and exposure, because we know that having leadership is still a challenge. And so that's where we wanted to invest. And so that's for above the line and a bit below the line, some specialized positions below the line on set. And we also took their money and put it into cultural training. So you can apply to us. And that is to support a document that we helped create in our first year, along with Imaginative, called the Protocols and Pathways document, which is meant to guide both our communities and others into the protocols and pathways to actually engage with Indigenous storytelling. And so we put money where you can apply to engage in proper protocols work with your production, because that was usually typically unfunded within the system, and our creators were doing it anyway, but that should all be paid. Elders should be paid if they are giving knowledge. And so we need to make sure that was supported. We've done data research. We did big international study on marketplace. We're about to come out with another study around the current production levels in Canada, because as many of my colleagues on this call will know, governments like data. They sort of insist on it when they want to fund. And yet, what a shocker, no one has been collecting Indigenous data in this country for, ever. And so they suddenly went, oh, well, we don't know. And so we're both playing some of their games to access it, with the idea being that once we access it, it's ours, and we'll do with it what we want. And I want to shut up, Charles, because I feel like I've been talking a lot, and there's way smarter people here. So I'll turn it back. So miigwech, chi miigwech.
Thank you, Jesse. And if that's what you're like when you're polite, I wonder what the other side's like. Kevin, do you have any questions of Jesse or of Keith?
I do, yes. I will stay with Jesse and then I'll go back to Keith. So one of the questions here, Jesse, is what does sovereignty look like in terms of institutional structure?
So I think sovereignty, I think, looks like autonomy and self-determination. It actually sort of looks like it does everywhere else, which is self-determination and autonomy. So like I'll use the Canada Council as an example. I think they're close. You know, when they created CKS, they put it with Indigenous leadership. It was designed with Indigenous people and it's run by Indigenous people. The head of it reports, there's two places, so they report to two down from the CEO. So there's one break in between there and the CEO. I would like to push them so that there's actually the only place they report to is the CEO. That there's actually no other, and that's about as close as we can get without creating a entirely separate Canada Council, which again wouldn't be opposed to. That would just serve Indigenous folks, and so I think that's what it looks like, and you get measures of that, but I think often what you'll see, let's say use the CBC, like it stops at a certain level of management, and suddenly they're answering to non-Indigenous folks, and that's the part we have to get through. Because one thing I will say, Charles and Kevin, and not quite in response to this question, but in response to the name of the title about representation. Representation is very important, and we need it because we need to see ourselves. When we're represented, it means we're not invisible, and that is really key just to our own understanding of self and place in the world. But representation without power is a shell game. And until representation comes with power, and by power I mean decision-making power. And I've been privileged enough in my career that even when I was in a non-Indigenous specific position, I did get power. I've had positions where I absolutely had power. I've also been in positions that were once powerful and had it stripped away from me, and I resigned pretty much immediately when that happened, because I'm not interested in being a cigar store Indian for anyone. I'm only interested in, I'm not even interested in the power for myself. I don't give a shit. What I care is can I make that, extend that to my community? That's all I care about. And so I do think we have to be careful that representation is not the end. It's a means to an ongoing, part of the ongoing struggle. And so that's how I would see sovereignty within those structures. I think it actually sort of appeals. I actually always use the example of Quebec because in Canada, we've literally created parallel institutions to serve culture in Quebec, and so that they can exercise some sovereignty over their decision-making, right? That you don't get Anglos deciding what counts as Quebec cultural content in Quebec. And yet that has been what was forced on our community for generations. And I think all we're saying is, well, we are in the same relationship with the state that any of the founding partners of this so-called country are in, which is it wouldn't exist without us. So we deserve the same consideration that you've granted to French and English. And so we push for these things at the Indigenous Screen Office literally at the policy level. So we submitted to the Broadcasting Act and Review Panel saying that wherever French and English appears, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit should appear directly after, and that should then mean the institutions that are formed under the Broadcasting Act and Telecommunications Act would then also have to follow those guidelines, which would mean every broadcaster in the country would have to follow those guidelines. And I'll answer one more. God, I'm way long-winded. But I just want to also say, we also launched in response to the current moment, a solidarity fund that we don't actually administer. That's not true. We administer it, but we don't make any of the decisions. It's in concert with BIPOC Film and TV, with I'm going to forget the other acronym, racial equity in the screen sector. They'll actually make the decisions. But we felt that as the ISO, we wanted to offer, again, we are a very small organization. We have 4 people. But we understood that we have more privilege than some of our Black cousins who may not have, or maybe aren't incorporated or have gone through the same sort of steps. And so we could take on the legal risk of administering those funds that some of our cousin organizations couldn't. And we did that when a lot of the other really wealthy organizations didn't do that. And I would point out that that's what solidarity looks like. It's us offering what we can without taking any control over it whatsoever. And we also placed that solidarity at the heart of what the ISO will do moving forward. So this won't be the last time that we can, our solidarity with our Black cousins, who are also Indigenous peoples, by the way, just so everyone is clear, we stand in solidarity with them in whatever we can do, because some of the arguments I make around narrative sovereignty aren't always available to others, because we're in the Constitution, other marginalized communities are not. And so it's our responsibility as we do this work to make sure that that space is open for others to come along too. And that's it. I just want to make sure that that's out there too, because I want to make sure other of the big organizations know that an organization with 4 staff and a budget of $500,000 could do that. And they're sitting there with all that institutional, generational wealth, and they've done nothing like that. And I don't know, judge us on our actions. That's what we do. And so that's what we're going to live by. And we'll judge every other institution on their actions too.
Thank you, Jesse.
Jesse, I want to break this whole thing up a little bit, because we're jonesing to talk to each other a little too. Come back to your question in a second, Kevin, but I just want to jump in here. Just thinking about sovereignty, because it is just thinking about these institutions and structural change, like thinking about if the basis of the country really is based in these kind of nation-to-nation treaties, if that's how Canada came to be, then wouldn't really, like, fundamentally, there should always be, even at the Canada Council, like the director, CEO should also have an Indigenous counterpart that has equal power and sharing. And so all institutions in Canada technically should be this way, like right across the whole country. And what would that do, like, in terms of really shifting? Like we try to do this in Canadian, like we switched it to Indigenous and Canadian, and we share the power and we have equal power. But really, it should be happening also at the director level, So how do we think about that as like a further step forward?
Thank you. I love the interruption. It's also part of why we're here. I have a question. This is for Keith. One of the barriers I feel as a non-Indigenous POC theater artist is that APOC leaders in our community are already so overburdened with mentoring huge numbers of emerging APOC artists. As we work towards more APOC-led organizations, how can artists seek and access mentorship from folks like you, and in bracket Keith, without burning you and other APOC leaders out?
It's a great question. I mean, I know that there's a free online class right now around Indigenous issues and histories that they offer online that people are signing up for. I think that there is a lot of resources out there that aren't directly related to coming to us for these questions and answers. To me, there's also lots of public, I mean, prior to COVID, there were spaces where you can go in the city to receive teachings, to open to the public, like to come and just interact with, with different ceremony, with different like different artists that invite people into their space who are there specifically in terms of in a teaching sense, who want to engage with public and bring. And I've been at a couple of those things where there's like 5 people show up. Like, to me, is like, I think those resources are out there if you really want to find them. And, you know, the Native Canadian Center does go on their website and you can take a look. I can't remember the DODM, does anyone know I get the email all the time. It's the elders. They are up at St. Clair and Yonge. Sorry, Wanda, you're saying it, but I think you're muted.
Dodom Kenosha.
Yes, if you look them up, they also do some brilliant classes and just like offerings like every week. People can come in and they are very specifically say, it doesn't matter where you come from, who you are, everybody is welcome. It's exactly like Jesse says. Like, it's how do we go about in a good way? We acknowledge that we are all here together. And so how do we sit in space together? And to me, it's like there are teachings and elders available. And so to me, it's like, that's part of that and, you know, education, I guess.
Thank you, Keith.
Yeah.
I have a question. Before I bring back one to Jesse, I'll just throw this one out, and it was directed to sort of everyone who were speaking. Althea Arnaque, that Burrell, I just completely messed up that name, posted a while ago about how so many Inuit organizations are not being run by Inuit, and how a lot of employees in those spaces are building work environments of impossible busyness. So I wonder about how we might build the spaces within our own organizations / practices to make sure the next generation can step into these roles without having work overtime for very little pay, and also making space and time for training future generations to be leaders in our institutions or in our own positions. Thoughts on that?
Was that, am I supposed to answer that?
Anyone can.
Oh, well, I'll just go very quickly, then throw it over to the more smarter people. In terms of I agree absolutely with Alethea. It's why the 4-year plan for ISO, we're not there yet because we haven't been fully funded, was actually to open regional offices. Because I don't believe that you can run a national organization of anything in a land this large from a centralized location. I often joke that our people have been here for a very long time, and we met all the time. And if any of our ancestors had thought it would be wise to form a central government to control a land as big, we would have done it. We didn't. We might want to take that hint. So the idea would be in Nunavut, we would have an office and it would be staffed by an Inuk. And the idea there is both, I want the organization and the communities always to feel welcome and to have someone they sort of know to speak to. But also it's twofold. Once we can get that, that's where the future leaders of the ISO will come from. That's where we'll train them. I mentor all the time, and my philosophy of management is always, that's what that is. You should be mentoring, always hire people smarter than you, train them to do your job, and then leave your job. That's what the cycle should be, and let them do it. And that's what I hope to do in both, frankly, both at the ISO, which will not be my long-term job, and at the Canada Council. It's a 5-year term, and then someone else will be up looking at you, Wanda. And then we can do something else otherwise, or maybe Charles can do it. Someone else. I think a woman would be preferable, but no offense to the dudes out there. But in general, they're preferable. That would be my message on that. We do need to train and let the community run and do these things. There's so much talent in this community that we don't need to look that hard.
Anyone else wants to share thoughts?
just thinking about how, like in the Inuit art field in general, it's like been so, it is particularly egregious how much it's been run by white people. And so I think that in that case, it is really extremely important that we get people into those roles and into mentorship programs as well. And I think that you can do this, like one, trying to create a whole position and doing all that, that's like very important with decision-making power and access to resources. I think that is central and key, but also I think you can do it project to project as well, because every project is an opportunity to train and to give leadership to the community as opposed to taking it for oneself. So I think, yeah, there's so many different ways that we can start to do that. The one thing I would say that was pointed out is like, yeah, we're so stretched to the max of what we can handle in terms of workload, and I'm a frickin' machine and I don't sleep much, so I can do a ton. But what suffers are those kinds of things like mentoring and all that kind of stuff, because you're so busy. It's really hard because those are slow processes, right? Mentoring is a slow process. Mentoring is a deep one, a long one. And I think that's where that is part of colonialism, is to keep us so busy that we can't actually build the structures that we need to actually be strong going forward. So I think that this is something that I'm trying to figure out how to resist, because it's also resisting my workaholic personality, is how to slow down and how to be really picky and choosy about what actually is going to do the most good for the next generation of cultural workers and curators and thinkers that are coming up. Because that is, in our culture, I'm an auntie now, like that's my age range. And, you know, I'm not an elder, but I'm, you know, training in some sense. It's my job right now to mentor and to start those relationships so that when I am at that age, I have a lot of wisdom to pass on. So, you know, busyness keeps us stupid.
Mm-hmm. There is another question here. And maybe Jesse, I'll offer for you to start if you don't mind, and anyone else can also contribute to it. It says here, how do we build data without instrumentalizing identity?
Boy, I wish I understood that question better.
I asked it, so.
Oh, did you? What do you mean?
I mean, there is this tension, right, between like wanting to check the box First Nations and then also wanting to be this free human being that gets to be whatever the fuck I want. And then the box telling me who I am, eventually, if I check that box too much, it starts telling me who I am. And so, you know, that tension, but we also need the statistics and we also need the data to be able to make our arguments and get that funding and get those structures working. This is the tension I'm talking about. You know, the tension, babe.
Well, now that you explained it, Wanda, I know. I can't keep up with you. I guess the way I've always approached it, or the way I recommend, is transparency. So when you're asking people for that information, tell them why you're asking, tell them what you're going to do with it, and like you have to, because I think, you know, I'll give you an example. At the Canada Council, they used to do employee surveys, and they would ask those sorts of questions, and they had have terrible responses. Like no one wanted to tick whatever box, and which is of course free their right. I pointed out to them, well, you've never actually told them why you're asking them, and then what you'll do. Like why is it meaningful for them to do this? And then when they said, well, we're asking because we want to actually measure the metrics as we want to be this, they went from like one survey, so quarter over quarter, they went from like 2.5% Indigenous to 6%, and they hired no one. It was just suddenly people went, oh, I will take it. And I think just be transparency, and transparency has come up before, and it seems such a struggle in colonialism because it's again sort of not, it's made not to be transparent. But it's like, if you just be honest and like say what you're doing, and if you say this is why we're asking, this is why it's important, and then we'll do it, then at least people will make an informed decision. They may still not want to check it, but at least they understand why. And I think we just need to always be as transparent as possible. Obviously there's privacy and everything, but these are all community organizations, community institutions. They should be accountable to the community. And the only way to do that is to be utterly transparent. And I think it's actually, once you start doing it, you realize, A, it's not that hard, and you sleep better because you're not holding bullshit in, and it's better for it to be out. And there's no, I think someone mentioned fear. I think Keith talked about people being afraid. Yeah, colonialism, capitalism is all about fear. It's all about making everyone afraid fucking constantly to do anything. And I refuse to be afraid of those things. And I refuse, if I do things wrong, and I do all the time, yeah, I want my aunties. I know for a fact my aunties will be the first ones to say, you come here, over here, youngster, and let me talk to you in this corner. And then I come out and I go, right, won't be doing that again. And you make amends. We just gotta be, we all just, Anishinaabe means people or human, which is pretty much what, sort of, ish, give me the ish, you nish, waving your hand over there. But like most indigenous nations, that's what they called themselves, the human beings, and I think if we could all just be human beings more often, especially our leaders who too often become, I don't know, bots, and they speak in this way that no one understands. We're human beings making human errors, running human institutions for humans. Let's all act like that, and it'll sort of be better.
Thank you, Jesse. Kevin, we're going to have to, we're at 3 minutes to 4, and we did agree that we would stop at 4. I really want to thank this panel. It was exciting having our CPAMO team meetings and talking about these Zoom panels we're having, and then of course to reach out to people that we've worked with, that we know for a number of years or more recently, and to have them all say, yes, would love to be part of this, as you've heard, is inspiring. I've learned a lot this afternoon, and this continuous journey of learning from First Nations peoples is so critical, I know, to my personal life. And I know I bring that into the work we do in CPAMO, and I know Kevin does, as well as Victoria. So I really want to thank everyone. Clayton, your long work with us, friendship, and your continuous adventure in the world is always exciting. Wanda, so great to have you in a session. I've heard you so many times before. We've hung out, and workaholic, as you self-confess, with a lot of brilliance and passion and commitment. Emma, who's had to move on, a newer face to us here, but lovely to have the Aboriginal Curatorial Collective as a partner again. We've worked with Camille Usher, before with Clayton, and we've worked with Ryan Rice and Jason Berg. It's nice to see the people who've come, who've given so much and are still giving more in other areas. Ashley, congratulations with Kata. Great to see you in that spot. We look forward to our connecting through CPAMO again and in other ways, and to see the marvelous work that we know you will do. Aria, always a pleasure, a joy, a space to kind of take a breath and learn and share as your ongoing adventures bring so much back to all of us. Keith, wow, yeah, the honesty of your comments, your work at Native Earth, the inspiration that center has been, and your acknowledgement of, consulting with, being in connection with those who came before you, to kind of say, okay, how do I proceed here? But your influence in the field, I mean, we all know Native Earth because of its organization, but we also have come to know you very well through your work there. And it's beautiful to see it continue, particularly during this troubling time. Oh my God, Jesse, wow. I guess you and I first met at TIFF some time ago. And, you know, marvelous the work you did there, marvelous the work you've done in the media community, your stuff with Canada Council and now the ISO. We look forward to that. I really do love that notion of solidarity that you pointed out. It so fits with the sense of what we started this thing with, the land acknowledgement, the dish with one spoon, that sense of, and also your acknowledgement that, you know, some of us who are cousins, as you said, I love that expression, you know, who have Indigenous backgrounds as well, not from this part of the earth, and also been victims of colonization and its ugly and brutal impact. And oftentimes, Indigenous communities have been there for us. When we've needed a place to run away from, we've needed a place to have shelter, we need a place there was some understanding. And it's beautiful to see how that continues in this day. So I really want to thank each and every one of you for a enlightening afternoon. And I really want to thank those who joined us at 1 and are still here at 4. There's a lot more to learn. And we will hopefully do this again, perhaps not in the next month or so, but you can be sure we will want to have these conversations more often. As I started at the beginning, say this is a time where transformation is absolutely essential. I love Jesse's notion that if Indigenous people wanted a centralized government, they would have done it a long time ago. So there's a hint. And I think that's an excellent way for us to perhaps conclude today, is are there other ways that we can live, and we know there are, where that will not take us into the space that has led us to where we now are. We got it, you know, we got to get out of this place, and we have to do it soon. So thank you, everyone.
The Beatles song.
Yep. We got to get out of this. If it's the last thing we ever do.
Thank you so much, Charles and Kevin and everyone over there for organizing this. It's a real privilege to do this. And congratulations, Clayton. I know all about your job, and you'll do great.
I don't, damn it.
Don't have it, Clayton. I'm calling you in. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
All right, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.